Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the end of year pensions process webinar for Type 2 self-assessments. My name is Debbie Roberts and I will be facilitating this evening's session. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Just to let you know that any data that you see during this evening's webinar has only been created for presentation purposes only. Okay, so just to let you know who's going to be on the call today, unfortunately our NHS Pensions colleagues having technical difficulties, they weren't able to attend. However, in the video you will see Angela McPhee, who's the Stakeholder Engagement Manager for NHS Pensions, and we'll then move on to PCSE colleagues, and we've got Katrina Veneris, who works in the GP Pensions team, and then you've got myself and Kat Van Paris, who's working in the background from the communications team. And then helping out in the background with the questions is some BMA colleagues and NHS England colleagues. So we've got Krishan Agwal, who's the Deputy Chair of the Pensions Committee, and we've got Janet Knox, who's the Senior Project Manager for NHS England Primary Care Services. Okay, so we do have a packed agenda this evening. So we will start with the NHS Pensions video, who will give you a brief introduction. They'll then run through the processing of the forms and where to find them, and then how you can submit them. And then we'll jump onto PCSE processes, and Katrina will run through the employee contribution statement, then looking at the 2022-2023 changes and how to complete those forms in PCSE online. She'll then discuss any under or overpayments of contributions. We'll then jump into some questions and answers. Okay, so I'm now going to hand you over to Katrina, that is going to play our video from our NHS Pension colleagues.
Hello and welcome to today's session. This is on Type 2 GP forms. My name is Angela McPhee and I'm a Stakeholder Engagement Manager at NHS Pensions. So on this session, we're going to have a look at the following. We'll have a quick introduction on how GP pensions work, an overview on the certificate and the annualisation calculator, and then we'll look at where you can find the forms and how you submit those forms to PCSE. So starting off, just as I said, just a quick overview. NHS England are classed as the employers for practitioners. However, they do contract that work out to Primary Care Support England, PCSE, and they deal with all aspects of practitioner pensions. PCSE are part of the Capita group and they won the contract to provide all GP services on behalf of NHS England, which includes all the pension aspects, including locum and solo forms. As practitioners are employed by NHS England, all administration is carried out by PCSE on their behalf and not by any individual practices. And NHS Pensions are the central administrators for the NHS pension scheme. So we'll just have a look now at some of the differences in the terminology that you might hear being used and what we use at NHS Pensions. This slide just explains what type of GP may be referred to by NHS Pensions. So your type 1 medical practitioner or provider is a partner, single-hander or shareholder GP. A type 2 medical practitioner or GP performer is a salaried GP, a long-term fee-based GP, or an assistant or portfolio GP. A locum practitioner is your freelance GP locums. And just to mention there, a long-term fee-based GP who works at the same surgery continually can choose to be regarded as a type 2 practitioner if they wish to do so. And a non-GP provider is a non-GP partner or shareholder. GP registrars or trainee GPs are not classed as practitioners. They are afforded officer status. So again, some background. Practitioners are usually self-employed. They are not classed as full or part-time for pension purposes. So if a practitioner works 80 hours a week, they must pension all of that work. They cannot pick and choose which GP employments they pension. It is an all or nothing approach. Unless opted out, a GP must pension all type 1 and type 2 practitioner work, including any out-of-hours work. Locum work can additionally be pensioned if the locum forms are completed within 10 weeks of undertaking the work. Work pensions on an officer basis must not be included in the year-end forms. That work will be provided directly to NHS Pensions via the relevant organisation. Also, any work which was not pensioned, any locum work for which forms of contributions were not submitted, should be omitted from the forms. The GP's pension contributions are based on the entries submitted by the practice on the estimate of pension profits form, and the contribution tier rate should be based on each GP's global income. If the estimate of pensionable profits is not submitted by the deadline, the maximum contribution tier will be deducted from each GP listed at the practice. PCSE then use this information provided to collect the contributions from the practice at the correct rate and submit them to NHS Pensions. So type 1 practitioners can be involved in several primary care NHS contracts, so they may be a partner in several different surgeries. If a GP has responsibility at more than one surgery and they're named on each surgery's contract, they must complete an estimate of earnings form for each surgery, and the contribution rate must be worked out based on their total GP income from all sources. Practitioners must declare all pensionable income, so that's their practice work plus any ad hoc, on an annual certificate of pensionable profits, and that must be submitted to PCSE within 11 months of year end. Any other work that is undertaken during the year, including the estimate of earnings from a different practice, should be completed on each of the forms. And work where any pension salary GP work may have been undertaken in the same scheme year, a type 2 form also needs to be completed. So at type 2 practitioners, so although a salaried GP is employed by a practice, their employing authority for NHS pension scheme purposes is PCSE NHS England. A salaried GP's pensionable income is their practice salary, including any overtime, plus any ad hoc income net of expenses. The practice must list them on the estimate form prior to the start of the year, and the GP must complete the self-assessment form at year end. Both of those forms can be found on the NHS Pensions website. Where a GP elects to work for a practice on a long-term self-employed basis, but they are not locum, they are treated the same as though they're a salaried GP in pension scheme purposes. Their pensionable income is their salary income plus any ad hoc income net of expenses. It's worth mentioning that salaried GPs who are formally employed by a practice are subject to auto-enrolment. As automatic enrolment has a 3-year cycle, the practice must enrol a salaried GP back into the NHS pension scheme 3 years after the initial staging date, and then at every 3-year interval thereafter by liaising with PCSE. The salaried GP must complete another SD 502 opt-out form if they wish to remain opted out of the scheme at the point that auto-enrolment takes place. And any locum who has continually worked at a practice and is classed as a type 2 must complete this form, but they're not subject to auto-enrolment. So if you had any medical practitioner NHS pension scheme membership in the year from the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023, you must, under statutory legislation, complete the relevant forms. You are legally required to pay the same rate of tiered contributions in respect of all of your GP pensionable posts, and you must proactively liaise with all of the relevant NHS organisations you work for to ensure you pay contributions at the correct rate. Failure to comply with the NHS pension scheme regulations may result in your pensionable pay being provisionally set to 0 for that relevant period. All of the relevant forms and guidance for GP pensions can be found on the website under the Member Hub. It is important to ensure that the practice submits that estimate of pensionable profits each year on time to ensure that the correct tier rate is deducted for each GP. If that form isn't completed and submitted to them by the deadline, they may take the maximum amount contribution rate from each GP until they get that information from you. So the difference between the form from previous years and why that is important. So during 2022-23, the tier rates for NHS pension employee contributions changed mid-year from the 1st of October 2022, and that created the requirement to apportion pensionable earnings between 2 separate periods. First period is from the 1st of April 2022 to the 30th of September 2022, and then from the 1st of October 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. Due to this change, the tiered employee contribution rates for each period are shown as separate boxes and tabs on this year's forms. Full information regarding that change can be found on the member section of our website. The NHS pension regulations state that the periods for this year must be annualised separately. So where a GP is a member of the 2015 scheme during 2022-2023, and they have had no breaks in service, their tiered rate is based upon their total NHS GP income. Where a GP provider is a member of the 2015 scheme and there's been a break at some point, annualisation of the 2015 scheme GP income may need to occur. We have at NHS Pensions produced guidance and an annualisation calculator to assist members in determining the correct tier rate for 2022-2023. So as we said, it's split into two periods and they do need to be annualised separately. So the first period from the 1st of April 2022 to the 30th of September 2022 is 183 days. And from the 1st of October 2022 to the 31st of March 2023, it's 182 days. It is important that these forms are completed correctly to make sure that the correct pension contributions have been taken and that GP pension records and benefits are correct. This is important to complete as we want to ensure that when you come to retire, all of the information is correct and updated with NHS Pensions. So on the form this year, for that year, there will be two tabs. So you'll need to complete one tab for the 1st of April 2022 to the 30th of September 22, and then again, another tab on the certificate from the 1st of October 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. So looking at the Type 2 certificate, that Type 2 certificate must be completed by salaried GPs employed at a GP practice or an alternative provider of medical service, an APMS contractor, local health board or primary care network or other organisations providing PCN subcontracted services. Any long-term fee-based self-employed GP who works for a practice, APMS contractor or local health board, and any GPs who work solely on a self-employed basis for an out-of-hours provider that is has access to the NHS pension scheme, or on a self-employed basis for an NHS trust or foundation trust that provides out-of-hours services. So there is guidance on our website alongside that Type 2 certificate, and you can find that under the member hub of our website as shown on the screen. The main difference, as I said, between this year's and previous year's certificate is that split period. So again, just to emphasise, there are two tabs on the certificate, one for each period. So annualisation. From the 1st of April 2022, as all members are in the 2015 scheme, the tiered employee contribution rate for a medical practitioner is based on their global and annualised income. For example, a GP practice plus self-employed out of hours plus self-employed ICB work. All breaks in pensionable service in the year 22-23 must be accounted for irrespective of the type of GP or length of the break. The GP is not regarded as being in continuous pensionable service during a break. And to assist GPs, NHS Pensions have developed a 2022-23 annualisation calculator in which the GP enters details of their GP work and income to determine the correct tiered employee contributions rate. And I do have a couple of examples of that to show you. So, the NHS pension regulations were modified from the 1st of April 2023 in respect of annualisation during the scheme year for 2022-2023 to account for that mid-year tiered employee contribution rate change. They specify how annualised pay is calculated under two different methods depending on the type of membership. So for Type 1 GPs, as pensionable earnings are determined by practice profits and therefore do not apply to a specific date of work, total pensionable pay is apportioned between the two relevant periods based on the number of pensionable days. The annualised pay is then calculated for each relevant period based on the apportioned pensionable pay and pensionable pay in each period. So where a member only has a Type 1 post during 22-23, the annualised pay for each relevant period will be the same amount. For Type 2 GPs and Locum GPs, as the actual pensionable pay for each period of work is known, the annualised pay is based on the actual pensionable pay earned and the number of pensionable days in each relevant period. So this method of annualising for 22-23 is different to the examples previously shown in the guidance for solo and locum that is on our website, which were based on the understanding that following the mid-year tiered employee contribution rate with effect from the 1st of October, the tier rates would be determined by annualising the pensionable pay for the whole scheme year for all types of practitioner posts. This may result in more contribution adjustments than previous years following the submission of those 22-23 annual certificates. So we have updated the annualisation calculator for 22-23 to help you calculate the annualised pay for each relevant period and determine the correct tiered employee contribution rate for each relevant period too. So when using that annualisation calculator, it is important to enter the type of GP work undertaken. The calculator recognises 3 different types of work, which each contributes to the total GP income used to set the tiered employee contribution rate. So those 3 different types are your type 1, your type 2, and your locum. So you would enter the dates and income for each period worked as a type 2 GP. So for example, the type 2 GP who worked from the 1st of July 2022 to the 28th of February 2023 should enter the pensionable profit figure for the 2 periods of work, and the calculator will apportion the profits between the 2 periods. So the calculator inputs would be from the 1st of July 22 to the 30th of September 22. Actual pensionable pay would be £15,000. And from the 1st of October 2022 to 28th of February 23, the actual pensionable pay was £32,500. So if we have a look on this next screen, you can see that example there showing on the screen as it looks within the calculator. So you would take this here, and there's a drop down to put the relevant type in. So this is a type 2 with the dates and the pensionable pay for each period. If you want to add different lines, you just click on the add row. But when you've finished adding all those periods of employment, you click calculate, and you can see there it's annualised the pay to £59,510.87 for the period between April and September, and £78,559 for the period between October and March. And it's set the relevant contribution rates accordingly, 12.5% for the first period and 13.5% for the second period. Next example shows where it's a type 2 and a locum. So in this period, you have your type 2 in the top line there. You can see the start and the end date and the pensionable pay for that period. But then each individual period of locum work would have to be added separately along with the pensionable pay to make sure that it's apportioned correctly and annualised. So again, once you hit calculate, it will apportion the pay between those 2 periods and set the contribution rate at the right tier as well. So you can see in that example, it's calculated the annualised pay as £98,777 with a contribution rate of 13.5%. And from October to March, it's £100,076 and the contribution rate is 13.5% again. It does have the contribution tier rates underneath as well for you to refer to. Where a type 1 or type 2 GP also performs solo work, so any self-employed out of hours or appraisal work, in addition to their ongoing main type 1 or type 2 posts, it must not be entered into the calculator as a separate post. That's because the solo income is not annualised separately, even if the solo work is irregular, providing that the GP also has an ongoing type 1 or type 2 post. Instead, the solo income is added to the type 1 or type 2 income before annualising occurs. This means that if the GP did not work a full 365 days in the year, the solo income will form part of the annualised income. Where a GP only performs solo work and does not have any ongoing type 1 or type 2 practitioner post, their pensionable membership is determined by their contract for service arrangement. As I said, all of the information and guidance that is available for you is on our website under the Member Hub, information for practitioners and non-GP providers. Due to the complexities of the calculation of the correct split or pensionable pay and tier rates as a result of that mid-year tier rate change on the 1st of October 2022, the deadline for the certificates to be submitted to PCSE has been extended from the 28th of February to the 31st of March. If possible, you should submit those forms via PCSE online portal or via the Contact Us page of the PCSE website. They need to be sent directly to them. They don't come to NHS Pensions. They have to go through PCSE for them to update the record and make the necessary arrangements for pension contributions to be taken. Once they process that, as I said, they pass all that information on to NHS Pensions and your records are updated. So again, it is very important that the forms are completed accurately and submitted in a timely manner to ensure that those correct pension contributions have been taken. That ensures that GP pensions record and any benefit estimates are correct when you are asking us for them.
Okay, so thank you to Angie for recording that video for us. We're going to have some time for questions later on, but we're at the moment going to move on to look at the process for submitting your Type 2 form on PCSE Online. Before we get on to the submission of the Type 2 itself, then just want to take a quick look at the employee contribution statement functionality and make sure that everyone is clear as to the rich information that you can get from that functionality. Before completing your Type 2 self-assessment form, then the first thing to do is to take a look at your employee contribution statement on PCSE Online. So when you have logged into PCSE Online and click on the GP Pensions button at the Type 2 GP, then click your employee contribution statement button, and you will see that the contribution statement has populated with the details of the GMC number and the SD number that I have for this test account that we have created with fictitious data. So with the contribution statement, then we can select the financial year. So we want to look at 22-23, and if I click search, then what we will see is all of the contributions that PCSE have on record for me for 22-23 are displayed in month order. We can see here that there's a mixture of monthly salary, so for the salaried post at the practice I work, and there's also some solo earnings and some locum. If I want to isolate any of my employments or posts, then I can filter. So if I want to filter on locum and then click search, then you can see that I can look at purely the contributions that relate to the locum work. Going back to all of my posts, then if I scroll down, importantly, we can see at the bottom of the screen, we've got a button to allow me to download a PDF or to download a CSV. If I click download CSV, then at the top of the screen, you will see a file that you can then open. If we click on that file to open it, then you will see that we have all of the contributions for the year in CSV format. So it's handy to have this for reference if you're completing the form yourself, but absolutely if you're using either an accountant or advisor or your practice manager to complete the Type 2 form for you, then I would make sure that you download a copy of the employee contribution statement and share it across with them. So that just give you a quick overview of the employee contribution statement and how to download it from PCSE Online, etc. So moving on now to completing the Type 2 form itself. So we're going to run through the process again, as Debbie mentioned earlier on, using fictitious data from a test account, and that will let you see the process in its entirety as you will see it when you go to complete the form yourself. To complete a Type 2 self-assessment on PCSE Online, then once we have logged in and clicked onto the GP pension space, then we click self-assessment, Type 2, then self-assessment, and what we'll see is that all of the details from my fictitious test accounts have auto-populated, so the pension scheme membership number or SD number, GMC number, etc. Because I've logged in as the GP. If I then scroll down and I will select the financial year that the form relates to, so I'm looking for 22-23, and then this will populate the practice or practices that I've worked at in that year. So just like the first tab on the form on the NHS Pensions website, then we have to tick to see whether there has been any approved leave during that year. So we say no to that, and then we're going to save and next and move on to the next tab. Now we are in the April to September tab in the 22-23 form. You can see on the left-hand side we have the navigation menu showing the different pages or tabs of the form. We can hide this menu so that we can see the page blown up and it's a little bit easier to navigate. So the first thing we need to do is, based on the outcome of the figures being entered into the NHS Pensions annualisation calculator for 22-23, then we choose our tier rate and the tier rate that the calculator has derived for us. So for this particular GP, then April to September has a tier rate of 5.6. So we select the tier rate. You can see by clicking on the screen here all of the tier rates for the 6-month period, or that apply to the 6-month period. So if you need to look that up again, then you can do while you're in the screen. Then if we scroll down the form, we'll see that we have our practice income for the salaried post pulled through from PCSE Online. So if we just think about the middle column for a second, then this is the contributions already paid column. So from a practice income point of view, these are the figures that have pulled through, that have been deducted from the practice during the year based on the estimate that they submitted for me. So we've got £375 for that 6-month period in employee contributions already paid. Now that starts to calculate based on the tier rate that I've selected, whether or not that's the right amount or an under or an overpayment. But what we can then see is that if I've got a record of my actual income for the 6 months, which was just a little bit different to the 7,500 on the estimate, so if it was 7,750, then what we'll see is these figures will then change in that right hand column, and that tells me what the difference is in terms of the contributions that have already been deducted and the contributions that are actually due based on that tier rate. So that's the practice income for April to September. We also have some solo work. So I have solo work of £1,500 in that 6-month period. There has already been £84 of employee contributions paid on that, and that has calculated to be exactly the right figure. So there's no difference in that final column. Then if I scroll down to the locum work, then we'll see that I've had £1,600 of locum income in that period. The contributions paid through my Locum A and B forms, £89.60, which has calculated to be exactly right, which means I've used the correct tier rate at the time. So we can now move on to looking at the second period of 6 months of the year. We've got these calculations at a 6-month level, but the main thing really is to move on to the full year at the end. So let's get through the next 6 months. Now we move on to October to March, so the second 6-month period of the 22-23 year. Once again, we take the tier rate that's been calculated using the NHS Pensions annualisation calculator, which comes out at 6.1%. So same as the first 6 months really, I scroll down to check my salaried income, and in this period I also had a slight difference to the estimated income, so 7,750, and again that changes the difference between the contributions already deducted from the practice and what is due based on the tier rate. So we also in this period have some solo income, which the employee contributions have been paid at the correct tier rate on already, and we have £1,900 of locum income, which again, when I've been submitting my Locum A and B forms, I've paid at the correct tier rate. If I haven't, and when I do the end of year reconciliation, then I need to make a shortfall payment, then I'll explain how to do that. But essentially, we need to have that payment received and processed and adjusted against the GP's record before we can fully reconcile the type 2 form at PCSE. But in this instance, then my tier rate was set at the correct rate when I paid my contributions on my Locum A and B forms, so the type 2 is more straightforward. So we then move on to the full year tab. So if I do save and next at the bottom here, then we have the total pay summary tab presented to us now. So again, let's just hide that navigation menu to make it easier to see. So what happens here is the 2 6-month periods are summed in the form, and the contributions already paid are summed in the form, and the difference that is then due is calculated. So we've got £104.25 difference between contributions already paid and contributions due. And that's the employee contributions against this sandwich medical practice. And when this is processed at PCSE, then that adjustment will be taken and made against that practice. If we scroll down, then we can see, just as expected, that our solo, post and locum work, the employee contributions are perfectly fine. So the total employer contributions is also calculated, and the employer contributions paid is pulled through from PCSE Online, as we can see on the screen here. I don't have any additional voluntary contributions, any AVCs in this GP example, but if you do, then this is where you will see your AVCs displayed. So if we click on Save and Next, and this is where I come to the declaration page. So I have the standard declaration wording that appears on the NHS Pensions form. So I just need to check all of that, make sure I'm happy with it, tick to confirm, and that will populate with today's date, the date that I'm going to submit the form. I can again save it for later, and I can save the form for later at any point, but we can then also go on to submit the form. And that is the end of the process. Okay, so that gives us the end-to-end process for completing and submitting the Type 2 form on PCSE Online. Going to come on to one or two practical things around the end of year reconciliation in a moment. There's a couple of other pieces of functionality related to those online submissions that we thought it would be helpful to share with you. So you will see in a moment what happens in terms of the status of the form once you've hit that submit button and it's made its way to PCSE, and then we've got another short snippet to show you what happens when PCSE have reviewed the form that you've submitted. You'll see when we get onto these examples that they are type 1 forms, but it's pretty much the same process for a type 2. We go to the type 2 self-assessment area on PCSE Online in the pension space, and then you have two buttons in that space. One is self-assessment form for completing and submitting a form, and the other one is a listing screen, and that's the one that we use for these other steps when we want to do any checking. So I'll run through these two short videos and then we'll get on to some of the more detailed stuff about the reconciliation. Now, once we have submitted a certificate, then if we want to just check that it has actually gone through, then if you go back to the annual certificate button and this time go to the listing screen, then if we click search, we'll see that our certificate here has got a status of declarated, and that means that it is now waiting for PCSE to review. Once it has been reviewed by PCSE, then that declaration status will change to approved, hopefully, if everything's fine with it. or if there are any issues, then it will change to rejected. If I then go back to my listing screen and then just search again for my certificate, then we can see that it is now showing as status approved, and that's it. That's the process completed. The adjustment that was due to be paid back to the practice will be in the next available contractual statement, and if nothing changes, that is all I have to do. You will see that if you scroll to the right, there is a resubmit button. So if something was to come to light at a later date where I needed to make an amendment to this certificate, then if I click resubmit, it will effectively create a new draft, and I will be able to make any updates to the certificate. But as I said, then that really, for the vast majority of people, will be the end of the process. Okay, so hopefully it's good to be familiar with that functionality. Like I said before, then for type 2, then there is that listing screen button in the type 2 area, and once you go into that listing screen, it looks exactly the same as we've just shown you there. So we do get quite a lot of questions around people who have been trying to complete their type 2 form on PCSE Online but contact us to say that they're unable to do it. If I just show you on the screen here. Now, when you go to the start of the type 2 form and it's populated with your details and you go to select the financial year, if you see the message that says already initiated stroke completed, then you will see that message if you have already completed and submitted the form, but you will also see it if there's a draft form of any description has been started for that year. So what you need to do if you do see that message is if you go to the listing screen, so we go to the self-assessment type 2 button and we click on the listing screen annual income listing button, and then if you click search, so just like we were doing looking for the approved and declarated forms once they've been submitted, but if you click search, then you will see that the form appears in draft status. Then when you have found your draft, so you've got your financial year here as 22-23, if you click the blue hyperlink, that will open the form and you will be able to carry on completing it. And so if you've only maybe just started it on the first personal details page, or you've got into it and you've saved it for later, then if you go to the listing screen, you will find it in draft format. Click the blue hyperlink and that will allow you to carry on. If for any reason you want to just delete that draft and start again, then you just need to scroll along to the right. So where we've saw draft there in step 3, if you take the scroll bar along to the right, then you'll actually see that there's an action column, and that's where you can click delete. And once you've deleted that, then you can go back to the type 2 form button and start the form from scratch. So that's, as I say, one of the key areas that we get asked a lot about. One of the other questions that's coming up a lot is around people who are saying, I can't see this screen, so they don't see anything at all coming up for 22-23 or for the practice that they have been working at. And that can happen if the pensions joiner form to commence contributions for you at that practice has never actually been completed. Now, for a practice to be able to complete the pensions joiner form, and it's very easy to do in PCSE Online, but for them to be able to do that, then the GP themselves needs to have completed the performer record update or the employment change form in the performer list area when you've logged into PCSE Online, so of your performer record. So if you're finding that you haven't got that practice that you've been working at in 22-23 showing when you go into the type 2 form on PCSE Online, then go back to your performer list area, check that employment change, employment update that you submitted when you started at the practice, and make sure that the practice have approved it. If the practice have approved it, then all they need to do, so the practice manager or the administrator at the practice that looks after the pension contributions and administration side of things at the practice for GPs, then all they need to do is log into PCSE Online, they go to the pensions joiner form and they enter the details there of your estimated income and tier rate for the year. And the joiner form can be completed retrospectively. So although we're in February 24, even if you started the practice as far back as April 22, so the start of 22-23, then the practice can actually go in and complete the details, confirm the start date, and then that joiner form will automatically calculate and collect from the practice in the next contractual monthly statement. They'll collect the arrears due for the time period that you have been working there. Once that process has taken place, then when you go to your employee contribution statement, then you will see all of the contributions for the practice, and when you go to your type 2 form, then you will be able to complete it. So check with the practice if they've completed the pension joiner. If they're having problems doing that, then that is most likely because the performer list element hasn't been updated. So either the practice hasn't approved that when you've submitted it, or perhaps you may not have actually submitted that at the time. So those steps need to be done before you submit your type 2 form. And when they have been, the submission of your type 2 form will be just as straightforward as my example on the screen. So that's kind of troubleshooting why people have problems with the form. So reconciliation of contributions. So let's just run through a few of the key points here, and then we'll start to look at some of the questions that people have submitted tonight. But we have had a lot of questions up front about some of these elements. So type 2 then, we've got 3 different types of income potentially, depending on the portfolio of work that you do. So everyone who works as a salaried GP in a practice, you'll have that monthly salaried element. The example showed on PCSE Online how the adjustments are calculated to calculate any overpaid or underpaid contributions. So if the reconciliation calculates that there's been an overpayment of contributions for a salaried GP, then the practice that you worked at will receive a refund in the next contractual statement after the certificate has been processed. If reconciliation shows that contributions have been underpaid for a salaried GP, and don't forget, this is when we say overpaid or underpaid, this is through the monthly collection of contributions from the practice, which is all based on the estimate that they submitted at the start of the pension year, and that may be slightly different to what you've had deducted through your pay slips or P60, and we'll come on to that. But the calculation of the adjustments in terms of making sure that NHS Pensions have received the correct amount of contributions for you as a salaried GP, now that the correct tier rates, etc., have been identified, then if there's any underpayment of those contributions compared to, so when we compare that to the practice estimate, then the arrears will be deducted from the practice in the next contractual statement, again after the certificate has been processed. So that's how that works for your practice posts. If you have solo work, so solo work can obviously be for an out of hours provider, you might be a clinical leader board member for an ICB, or you may also, or alternatively, have been an appraiser for the NHS England region, a GP appraiser. So if you're a type 2 GP, then all of those posts would be solo posts. If there has been an overpayment of solo contributions because the tier that provider has been calculating your contributions at during the year is, turns out to be a higher tier than you actually needed to be on, then the process that PCSE need to follow is to refund that overpayment to the provider. And then they obviously need to look at what they have deducted from you at source and look to see whether there is a refund due to the GP themselves. If there's been an underpayment for your solo work because, conversely, the solo provider has had been submitting your contributions on a monthly basis at a lower tier rate than your annual reconciliation ends up calculating, then PCSE then need to contact the solo provider to request that underpayment. Once we've got that payment, then your form can be fully reconciled and your record updated, but only when that provider has paid the shortfall. So that's solo work. And then finally locum. Then locum, if you've paid your contributions at too high a tier, once your type 2 has been processed, PCSE will initiate a refund request so that that's paid directly back to the GP locum themselves. But if there's an underpayment, again, if you've submitted your locum A and B forms with a lower tier than the year has kind of panned out to be, then PCSE will contact you to request that payment. So again, there's a shortfall process that you need to follow to make those payments, and after we have the type 2 form fully reconciled, then your record can then be updated. So that covers off our different income types, I guess. There's a couple of other things just to highlight, and they are a little bit more difficult because they have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But it may be that when you submit your 22-23 form, in a few circumstances or few cases, the practice may have already effectively closed, but the contract is no longer active. So maybe there's been a change of hand, re-procurement, etc. If a practice has closed, then PCSE need to seek guidance as to the handling of any over or under payments on a case-by-case basis. The same for out-of-hours providers. If an out-of-hours provider that you worked for is no longer, under contract, is no longer providing that service, then PCSE in that case need to contact NHS Pensions on a case-by-case basis. I should say about practices that if there's been a merger, if the practice you worked for has merged with another, then the practice that took over, if you like, carries on the sort of liability for the pension contributions. So PCSE would be making any adjustments against that practice. But if it has completely closed the contract, as there's been a total change of provider, then that's when these things do take a little bit of time. So just wanted to make you aware of that. But just getting back to that locum work, so if you do identify that you need to make a shortfall payment, so your contributions for your locum work haven't been paid at the tier that your annual self-assessment has then calculated, then when you go to the PCSE website, we have a locum shortfall payment template, and when you download that payment template, it looks like the screenshot on the right, and it's important that you complete that in full for us and send that in to us, so that when you make the payments to NHS England's bank account, then we can promptly match that to your record and update your contributions, with the correct allocation, and that will then bring your PCSE online record up to date and allow us to complete that final stage of the reconciliation of your type 2 form. So the end of year guide that we've developed for type 2 covers this process off. The 3 steps really are that we've downloaded the template and complete it. You make the BACS payment, so there's an instruction on the format of the BACS reference to use so that we know that it's definitely from you and what it relates to. You submit that template to us through the Contact Us form on the PCSE website, and then PCSE will pick that payment up when we get the weekly transaction list from NHS England. We'll match it to the template that you've submitted to us, get your record up to date, and then, as I say, your certificates can be fully reconciled. The guidance from a PCSE point of view, so Angie's video highlighted where to go on the NHS Pensions website for guidance, and it's really important that you do look at that before you complete a type 2 form. But you also have this guide from PCSE where it looks at the steps of the process and explains to you how we go through that reconciliation. So if you go to the website, we've got a number of resources, but as I say, this type 2 guide is absolutely key, and this is where we will put the up-to-date videos and so on to show you the kind of submission process, etc., for the type 2s, so that you have that for reference should you want to look back to it. So I think we're now going across to the live Q&A. So there are a few questions I can see there about the practical elements of using PCSE Online, but that whole thing about save and next, and when you then try and go back to the form and it's saying that it looks like it's telling you it's already processed. So I've covered that off to say that you need to go to the listing screen if it says that when you go to the type 2 form screen, and then you'll see your draft. I think there's a few questions about annualisation calculator and guidance. So we have spoken to our NHS Pensions colleagues over the last few days. They have their technical team looking at that, so bear with that. The annualisation calculator, for some people at least, when you download it, is throwing up a Microsoft macro security type error. It's doing that for me, it's doing it for some others from our team and from our BMA colleagues and so on. So NHS Pensions technical team are looking at that and working to get that resolved, basically, so as quickly as possible. There are a couple of questions about maternity and breaks of leave, so I think we're going to put together a little fact sheet for that and deal with that and publish that for you in the next week or so, so that we'll cover that off. So we do have also some questions, I think, about once things are processed on PCSE Online, when do I get my pension record updated on the NHS pension system? So on Pensions Online, a lot of you might have access to the My Pensions app, hopefully. So from the point when PCSE process the end of year certificate, we have a deadline of mid-June from an NHS Pensions perspective, where they take a data cut, and all of the data that we've been able to get brought up to date on Pensions Online by that point will be added to the summer TRS refresh. And if there is, anything where there's been difficulty with the reconciliation or any reason a form hasn't been processed by that point, then it would come into the next TRS refresh. One thing to point out, when you check on your PCSE Online listing screen, you'll see all of the years that have been approved. If there are any gaps, so if you have, for example, maybe 2017-18 hasn't been approved or reconciled, maybe there was a problem when you submitted it at the time, then you will need to submit that form and wait for that to be processed to fill the gap, because some people will be very aware, but maybe not everyone is, that the NHS pension system can only be updated sequentially. So if there is that 1 year gap, then even if all of your certificates or type 2 forms for the subsequent years, so 2021, 21, 22, etc., have all been processed and are showing approved on PCSE Online, you don't see that on your Pensions Online record until the gap has been filled, and then we can update all those sequential years immediately. I think someone's asked about how they can access their TRS. So if you go to the NHS Pensions website, then there is some detailed information on accessing your TRS. So someone's asking about if they've already retired, do they put their retirement date as the end date in the annualisation calculator? Annualisation calculator, you put the periods that you worked. So I guess if you've retired during 22-23, the end date of your period of work will be the last date that you worked. So it would just be, you treat it the same as though you've left a post and moved to another post. Look, we're trying to cover off the questions that will, apply to as many people as possible. The self-assessment form has completely different earnings to what I earned in my salaried role. Will my form be rejected? So your form on PCSE Online, as I was mentioning earlier, will populate with the figures from the estimates that the practice entered or submitted for 22-23. It's quite common that for various reasons, even salaried GPs end up with a different annual income for the practice work than was estimated. So in your self-assessment, then when you go onto PCSE Online, then you would enter that final salary that you had for that full year. And then you would enter, and if you look at the PCSE guidance, then it advises you to then enter the figures that were actually taken from the practice. And the reason for that is so that the practice adjustment can be calculated and applied to the practice to make sure that the correct amount has been paid over to NHS pensions. Now, I totally appreciate that. I think this is a clear example of it, that in some cases you may have different amounts that have been taken at source through your payroll from your P60 to what is showing on the, or was showing on the estimate form. So there's a second reconciliation really that you would then do with the practice themselves to say, well, okay, I now know as a GP what tier rate I should have been on, etc., and what, you know, was to be paid in total. This is what's been deducted from me during the year through payroll, and this is the separate reconciliation to that. I think for reassurance, I think if anyone has already submitted their type 2 form and they have actually just taken the figures from their payroll or P60, you know, pay slip information in terms of that contributions already paid figure, then our NHS England contract management team and NHS Pensions have agreed that PCSE can, you know, go directly to PCSE online and take the figures that are required to calculate the practice adjustment to avoid having to reject that form back to you. There is quite a lot of detailed work going on between the three parties, NHS Pensions, NHS England and PCSE, to look at how the type 2 form in general can be improved, because I think in the past it has been trying to do two things. So as a GP yourself, you will want to have that reconciliation with your practice to compare what they've deducted from you through, you know, your monthly pay slips versus what you need to have paid over when you've done that end of year calculation. And then from a pension contribution or pension payover point of view, you know, PCSE's role is to make sure that the right amounts get paid over to NHS pensions. So, you know, there is a lot of work going on to look to see whether that type 2 form, you know, that Excel version can be enhanced somehow to allow you to see those two things together. And, you know, we'll talk about that in due course. But for this year, if you go to the website and follow the type 2 guide from a PCSE point of view, then that will flow straight through. But as I said, for reassurance, for anybody who has actually completed it differently and already submitted using their, you know, P60 figures for contributions already paid, then we're looking at the way that we can get those processed without having to send it back. So that's kind of that key point.
So hello everybody, my name is Christian Agarwal. I'm one of the GPs within the BMA and Deputy Chair Pensions. So there's quite a few questions in the chat in relation to officer income. As a GP, you may have practitioner income and officer income. It is only practitioner income that is used on the type 2 form, and you add up all your practitioner income to calculate your tiers as per the annualisation calculator. So I just wanted to make that clear. You'll be able to find out from your provider whether it's an officer or a practitioner. It is not straightforward. So, for example, there are out-of-hours providers that pension via the practitioner scheme, and there are some via the officer scheme, but they should be able to detail that to you. There's also a few questions about limited companies. If you work through a limited company, you are not able to pension that via the NHS pension scheme.
Thank you, Christian. No, that's really helpful. I can see there's quite a few questions actually about breaks during the year, and also, as I said, maternity leave and so on. So we have already taken a note to provide a fact sheet, and, you know, there is guidance around deemed pay, etc., on the NHS Pensions website as well. So please do refer to that, but we'll see what we can kind of bring to life as an example of completing on PCSE online for those scenarios.
There's quite a few questions about previous years. If you have been a type 2 GP in the past and you have not completed those type 2 forms, it is important to do so. You can go onto the NHS Pensions website and download the forms. The way that your NHS pension record is updated is that you need each in successive order. So, for example, if you're a GP since 2010 and your 2015 one is missing, but every other one is present, Your record won't be dated since 2015, but as soon as you've done that one, they will all slot into place. So if there are any type 2 forms that you've not done for previous years, you will need to go back and do that. And all the forms back until 2010, so when the requirement started, are on the NHS Pensions website.
Somebody has asked about when they go to complete the Type 2 on PCSE online and the previous years are in red, even although they've already submitted the forms. If you go to the listing screen, then that's where you will see what has and hasn't been processed for you. So the years that you've already submitted, and if you've had confirmation they've been processed, you should see them as approved. They show as red because they weren't actually done through the system, but that doesn't matter. It's the listing screen that you need to go to get the record of, you know, what's already been processed. So that's a key thing just to bear in mind, that listing screen and relates to Christian's point there, really about, you know, checking that there are no gaps in your record, so it all kind of joins together. Someone has asked about adding or including in your Type 2 form locum work if you decided not to pension it. So again, for the avoidance of doubt, you don't include that on your Type 2 form. So just, I think Angie did mention it in her video, but you only include the locum work if you have actually pensioned it. So if you've submitted locum A and B forms and the contributions at the time, we all know that the 10-week rule has been back in place.
So just wanted to pick up on that point as well. So absolutely, as a locum, you can effectively choose to pension your income or not, because you effectively have 10 weeks to submit your forms. Obviously, we always recommend that you pension your income, but obviously it's a personal choice. And if you do choose not to pension it, make sure that you get sound financial advice before not doing so. There's lots of questions about out of hours, about different scenarios where are they practitioner officer. It's very difficult to go through each one of those scenarios. So it may be that you just speak to your provider, but as a general rule, a salary GP will be in the practitioner scheme. Most out of hours providers will be in the practitioner scheme. There are very few that are in the officer scheme, but it may just be worthwhile clarifying that with the provider that you work with. There's also questions about what is gross pay and what's pensionable pay. So as a general rule, if you were to work as a salary GP, your gross pay is equivocal to your pensionable pay. If you do locum, you minus 10% as expenses, and then that becomes your pensionable pay. But again, there's lots of guidance and detail on the NHS Pensions website in relation to that, as well as on the BMA website.
Thank you, Christian. If one is salaried until end of August 22 and then becomes a partner from 1st of September, which form do I complete, and is the accountant able to submit the forms on my behalf? So yes, accountants can complete the forms on your behalf. If we're using PCSE online, then as the GP, you need to complete the final declaration. The accountant would complete the form. You would see that in that listing screen as pending, I think the status is. And then when you open up the form, go straight to the declaration page, confirm that you're happy with what's been completed, and then click the submit button, and then it comes into PCSE. The question about which types of forms, so from I think it was the 1st of September, then that would be a Type 1 form to cover that, and then you would have a separate Type 2 form from the beginning of April to the August period. So you unfortunately find yourself in the lucky situation of having to fill 2 forms in for that 1 year. So because you've had the 2 different types of posts, so salaried and a partner role. So I think we've had quite a few questions, and I've covered this point already, but quite a few questions asking about PCSE online. When I look at the employee contribution statement, it looks different to my pay slips. So I think make sure it's clear enough for everybody. The reason for that is that the PCSE online employee contribution statement, based on what was submitted as an estimate by the practice, and the end of year process needs to reconcile with the practice to say, you know, GPX actually should have, the contributions that should have been paid over for them is this amount. You've already paid that amount, so either practice owes for the underpayment or they are due a refund for the overpayment. And then separately, you need to look at what you've got on your pay slips and or P60 information, etc. And then with the practice, look at, you know, where that difference sits and whether they need to deduct anything extra from you, or whether in fact you need to have kind of payback from them for anything that you've been deducted in excess of what it turned out you needed to pay. So I hope that's a little bit clearer.
There's a lot of questions about solo forms. If you are receiving a solo form, that effectively means that you are a type 2 GP, and you will need to do a type 2 form for the relevant years that you received a solo form. So that's one way of knowing that you are in the practitioner scheme. If you're in the officer scheme, you would not receive a solo form.
Yeah, and that's probably something that I didn't call out particularly clearly at the start. I know that in Angie's overview, she did touch on, what is a type 2 GP, but I think that from previous events that we've had, there's been a lot of questions from people who don't have a salaried post at a practice, but they do, as Christian said, they do solo, what they do out of hours work that is classed as solo, and you would have a solo form. So technically for 22-23, you should have two. You should have one for the first 6-month period, which then reflects that set of tier rates, and one for the second 6 months.
I'm just going to go over the type 1, type 2, because there's still questions coming in about that. In effect, if you are a partner in a practice or a principal, you'll be completing a type 1 form. If you're solely a locum, where you're only doing locum work and no other GP work, you can submit locum A and B forms to pension your income within the 10 weeks. If you're doing other work, so out of hours, salary GP, working for other providers, you're more likely to be a type 2 GP. There are a few examples where some out of hours providers, etc., work under the officer scheme, and therefore you would not need to do the type 2 form for those pieces of work. Obviously, it becomes more confusing if you have multiple roles. So you may do a bit of out of hours, you may be a bit of a salary GP, you may do locum, etc. But if you do any type 2 work, you will need to do a type 2 form for that relevant year. I hope that helps.
There's a few people asking again about previous years and, what if I've not already submitted the forms or it got rejected at the time. So as we've already explained, that kind of causes a pause in the updating of your pensions online record. So the sooner you get any certificates into us for those gap years, then the better. Because there's a new form being published, then we start off with the focus on 22-23 submissions, but we'll be looking to get through everything that's submitted as quickly as possible. I think there's probably about 35,000 active GP pension scheme members, so a lot of end of year forms to get through. Somebody's asking about very small pennies difference. There's a £1 tolerance in calculations, so if you've calculated something that's less than £1, you shouldn't have to worry about it. Yeah, and a couple of questions I suppose throughout that are, about the calculation of your profitable pay, etc. And Christian's gave some really good pointers, but we had a type 1 webinar last night and it came out loud and clear there, and maybe, they could argue it's a little bit more complex when it comes to your profit, but there's quite a few people sort of advocating that you do get a specialist medical accountant to advise you if you've got questions. If it's if it's clear enough to you and you're happy enough with your understanding, then carry on. But I think it was just a sort of guidance between attendees and delegates sharing amongst each other really about doing that. So that's just something to bear in mind.
There's a few questions in relation to the forms. There are 2 ways to submit them. You can either download them from the NHS Pensions website and then go onto PCSE and submit them via Contact Us, or you can go directly onto the PCSE website and use the portal and submit the data there. So there are 2 ways to submit your type 2 forms.
So because it may not have been clear from the example I ran through, the GP had a practice that they worked at as salaried. They did some solo for an organisation and then they did some locum work. But if you have multiple solo organisations, which I think was the question, then they will list out separately. So when you look at the certificate in its Excel format, you'll see that there's different rows for the different employments of the same income type, and that flows through. I don't know if there's any final point that you wanted to add in, Christian.
Just that there are a lot of questions that are coming through to the chat still. We will try and answer some of those. I think PCSE and NHS Pensions will try and put a summary document of those that we will contribute to.
Thank you. So I'm going to hand back to Debbie. Really grateful to Christian from the BMA for supporting us tonight, and yeah, for all of you for bearing with us. So back to you, Debbie.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katrina. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you to you, Katrina, for doing the presentation with us this evening. You've managed to share lots of useful information. And thank you to our BMA colleagues, Christian and Jackie, and also thanks to Janet for supporting from NHS England with the chat and getting some questions answered. The guides are live on the PCSE website, and there's also lots of information on the NHS Pensions website as well. But yeah, so I'm going to make a close, and again, thank you all for taking your time out for joining us this evening, and I hope you found that useful.